Good evening, and welcome to Racing the Ballot. My name is C. Riley Snorton, and I'm a professor of English and Gender and Sexuality Studies and the interim faculty director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. Since its inception in 1996, the center has been committed to establishing and sustaining a space to center and expand the study of race and ethnicity by fostering interdisciplinary, transnational, and intersectional research, teaching, and public debate. At the center, we understand that race and ethnicity affect every idea and interaction, and we work to cultivate meaningful dialogue about the myriad ways race and ethnicity informed our lived experiences and scholarship. We hope that you will continue to stay engaged with the center and our activities by joining our listserv and subscribing to our weekly newsletter. I'd like to extend gratitude to our co-sponsors and collaborators on this evening's event, the Center for Identity and Inclusion out of the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs and the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to briefly introduce our illustrious panelist and moderator for Racing the Ballot, which considers voting, among other tactics, and centers racial, gender, sexual, economic, and social justice in today's political climate. I will introduce in alphabetical order. Marc Lamont Hill is a scholar, author, journalist, and activist. He is professor of media studies and urban education at Temple University. He attended Morehouse College and Temple University, and later earned a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, which incidentally is how we met. Professor Hill worked as a political contributor and commentator for Fox, CNN, MSNBC, Court TV, Huffington Post, and BET, to name a few, and is the founder of Uncle Bobby's Bookstore in Philadelphia. He's the author of Media, Learning, and Sites of Possibility, Beats, Rhymes, and Classroom Life, Hip Hop Pedagogy and the Politics of Identity, and Nobody, Casualties of America's War on the Vulnerable. He's the co-author of The Classroom and the Cell, Conversations on Black Life in America, and in less than 1 month, his latest book, We Still Here, Pandemic, Policing, Protest, and Possibility, will be released with Haymarket Books. Mikki Kendall is a writer, diversity consultant, and occasional feminist who talks a lot about intersectionality, policing, gender, sexual assault, and other current events. Her essays can be found at Time, the New York Times, The Guardian, The Washington Post, Ebony, Essence, Salon, The Boston Globe, NBC, Bustle, Islamic Monthly, and a host of other sites. Her media appearances include BBC, NPR, The Daily Show, PBS, Good Morning America, MSNBC, Al Jazeera, WVON, WBEZ, and Showtime. She's discussed race, feminism, education, food politics, police violence, tech, and pop culture at institutions and universities across the country, and it's truly a delight that she could be here with us today. She's the author of Amazon's Abolitionist and Activist, illustrated by A. D'Amico, and of Hood Feminism, both from Penguin Random House. Finally, our moderator is Marcus Lee, who's a PhD candidate in political science. His dissertation chronicles the emergence of Black, gay, and lesbian collectivities in the late 20th century. Specifically, he examines how issues that are repeated in Black, gay, and lesbian archives, including HIV/AIDS statistics, violence against women, and discourse on obscene art, came to constitute Black, gay, and lesbian people as a distinct subgroup. His work has been published in the Du Bois Review and The Atlantic. Before beginning graduate study at the University of Chicago, Marcus earned a BA in sociology at Morehouse College, where he was a UNCF Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow and was heavily involved in sexuality-based campus activism. He's a lay historian of early 2000s R&B, an expert dog sitter, and a professional Black sitcoms critic. I'll also say he's one of my favorite people to talk about the current political climate, and I'm so glad that he was available to moderate. Please join me in warmly welcoming our panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Riley. I just want to start by saying thank you to you for inviting me to be a part of this, what I think will be a really great discussion. And I'm really honored and excited to be moderating a discussion between two such forward-thinking people who have a lot to say about what's happening today. I also wanted to start by saying thank you to Tiara Kilpatrick, especially at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, who worked really hard to make sure this discussion could actually happen. So thank you to Tierra. All right, in terms of the structure for the event, so I've already prepared a few questions for our panelists that we'll start with, but I will we'll reserve a few minutes at the end for questions from the audience. So if you all could submit your questions throughout the discussion, we'll be sure to pull a few of those for the end of our panel. So let's start with the first question, which I think will be kind of a hard question given the times that we live in today. So to say that we're living in unprecedented times, I think would be an understatement. Just as a few things that we're encountering today include a pandemic, an unpredictable president, let's say, a fresh round of anti-Black racism and injustice. And so I want to ask you all, each of you, and I'll start with you, Mikki, what for you defines our current political landscape, or how would you describe our current political landscape?
This is going to sound like a joke, and it is, but it's not. We're in choose your own apocalypse. So we have a choice here, right? This doesn't need to be the apocalypse, but I would say that our current landscape is that people are having to make a decision. What's more important to you, racism or survival? What's more important to you, bigotry or survival? You can keep going down the road that we're on. I've seen this movie. You won't like the ending, okay? And I know that we talk about this as unprecedented times. Fun fact, as someone whose history degree stretches back to the classics, they're not really unprecedented. It's just that usually the description includes the words, the fall of. And we can skip the fall of if we decide not to choose our own apocalypse, right? You could wear your mask, you could wash your hands, you could vote for people who don't think this is all a hoax. There are a lot of things we can choose to do here. It's just a question of whether or not we're going to make a choice for survival or a choice for hate.
I agree. I think that, and first, just it's dope to be here with you, Marcus. Thank you for being a moderator of this conversation. Hanging out with Mikki is always fun. I always get to learn a lot and laugh a lot. So it's super dope. And of course, I'm grateful to Tara for helping to organize this, and my dear friend and colleague Riley for being not just a brilliant scholar, but a forward and visionary thinker on so many issues. Also, someone from whom I learned a great deal. I agree. This doesn't feel unprecedented to me. It feels like the logical extension of an empire in decline. And as Mikki said, the accompanying narrative, typically when we see moments like this, is the fall of. There are a few things that I think mark this moment that I think are particularly interesting. And again, we're seeing the sort of natural extension of and conclusion of a set of processes that have been ongoing. We sort of see Trump as an outlier, and there are ways that Donald Trump is absolutely an outlier. There's never been a president quite like Donald Trump. There have been other racist presidents, right? There have been other fascist presidents. I'm not suggesting that Trump is one of one, but there's a very interesting way that we try to construct him as this thing, this accident that sits outside of our democratic imagination and our democratic framework, when in fact, Donald Trump is the result of white supremacy. He's the result of neoliberalism. He's the result of fascism. And so at this very moment, as more than 200,000 people have died from COVID, many of whom did not need to die, as we see so many people jobless and unhoused, dying from preventable diseases, as Ruth Gilmore says, subject to premature death. I see a moment where we have rendered the vulnerable disposable. There's a politics of disposability that accompanies this moment. And that disposability politics is undergirded by a politics that fetishizes the market. And so as long as the market is the ultimate court of appeal to decide who the winners and losers are, who gets to live and who gets to die, who gets to thrive and who doesn't, who gets access to democracy and who doesn't, who gets safety and who doesn't, who gets healthcare and who doesn't, then we'll continue to see those who are rendered less usable and less exploitable to be increasingly disposable. And that's what we've seen for the last 6 months, right? Shut the country down. Everybody's sick. Everybody can die. Oh, wait, is poor people dying? Wait, who's in the hospital? Oh yeah, open it back up again. And that kind of logic is playing out in all parts of our lives.
And I would argue that we've seen even that attitude before, right? So 1918 pandemic, right? People think, and I will acknowledge, if you have enough money, enough savings for a storm, you theoretically can make it, right? And that is a thing that I think is playing into this, is that many people sort of think, well, it's bad, but it's not that bad. No one I know has died. No one I know, or the person who died was old, or, you know, because there's a narrative now that it's not really COVID, it is secondary condition, undiagnosed condition. In a country that doesn't have nationalized health care that barely provides preventative care for many of its people, you don't know who has an underlying condition. We are an underlying condition. And the reason I made the face about Trump as an outlier is because I always think of Andrew Jackson. I always think of how many times America has run right at that wall, right? And the fact that when we're talking about, I'm going to bring up Germany, and everyone's going to make that face, but you know, here we go, right? When we're talking about Germany and the Holocaust, when we're talking about oppression in other places, we always sort of have this weird pretense that it couldn't happen here, but it did happen here. Many of those, the camps and the solutions and all of those awful things that we think of as America having fought against in World War II, America was fully on board with. Some of the greatest crimes against humanity have happened under the auspices of that flag. And it's not like it's just us. I know someone's going to say, well, other people, yes, they did. And you know what we've all learned from this? Apparently nothing, because we keep doing that. Right? So we're not slipping down the hill towards fascism, being pulled by some inexorable force. We were making those choices before this, and then we didn't make the choice, and now the choice is on the table again. And once again, we're finding out how many people think white supremacy wins, I'll be safe, and screw those other people. It's not actually how it works. Just
yeah, no, I mean, I really like what you all are saying, especially about this reference toward history, right? I mean, I think maybe what I was saying was an overstatement, that these are unprecedented times. I think there are times that are hard to describe, but I mean, Mikki, to your point, I'd like to ask, what are the building blocks in recent history that have led to this moment? I mean, every moment is produced by something. So what stands out for you in that regard?
We're going to do history lessons again. Sorry. The next thing I'm working on has a lot of history, so this is where my brain is living. I'm going to roll us back to right after World War II, when Black soldiers returned, right? We were supposed to be coming back heroes, save the world from fascism, and they were lynched in their uniforms. I'm going to roll back. I know we sort of pretend that like slavery ended and like Jim Crow was a blip, and then, you know, Black people were reinvented in time for the March on Washington. But I'm going to point out that even the massive wealth gap we see has been structured specifically by policy, right? When we're talking about the American dream, and we don't talk about internment camps and what happened to Japanese families and their farms and why those farms were taken, or the financial reasons for lynching or any of these things, we also don't talk about the laws that were written then, the policies that were constructed. And then we get to this, and people are saying, well, if you can't feed them, don't breed them, you don't have this. And in a way, it is unprecedented. What's unprecedented is that we can see it happening all around the world at the same time. We don't have to wait for information to be in a newspaper, to be mailed. The internet has sped up the rate at which we know things. What has not changed, unfortunately, is our refusal to learn from our prior mistakes, right? So everyone that thinks right now that, well, what's happening now is bad, but my family is prepared. Most Americans are not temporarily embarrassed millionaires. Most Americans are 2 paychecks away from being one of those people whose safety net they've been told to undermine. As many people found out with unemployment insurance, and this is the building block moment, when we started gutting those safety nets, not just unemployment, the actual payments, but the people who work there. When we started having, remember all those conversations about all those overpaid government workers? A country of 300 plus million people cannot be run by 35 people. I don't care how good they are. I don't care how many arms they have. You kind of need 3-4 million people working to keep that running. Probably more like 30 million, right? But we said the government is bloated. Cool. Now we're saying, why can't the government get this right? You don't have the people for it. You don't have the technology investment and infrastructure even for those systems, because processing unemployment is a lot like processing food stamps, like processing Social Security benefits, like processing VA benefits. When they were telling everyone that they didn't need to pay for those things, that money was being wasted, what they were really telling you is that when the crisis comes, we will have no way to take care of you. And that's one of the things. We've had bad policy, and I'm not going to let any party off the hook. All of them, yes, including your favorite third-party options, have failed to show up for those ugly, boring meetings in between election cycles.
Yeah. A lack of investment in infrastructure. Yeah, for decades. Marc, you have anything to add to that point?
Yeah, I think the lack of investment in infrastructure is key. I think there are some other factors as well, and I think they all, again, come back to this question, I think, of what is the economic arrangement that the United States is built upon? What are the arrangements of power that allow us to get to a moment like this? Again, the privatization of the public good has been something that we've seen over decades. We've invested less and less in the public good, and we've privatized it. Whether it's mental health, whether it's housing, whether it's education, we've continued to invest less and less in the public good. This creates less of a safety net for the most vulnerable. So when we enter a moment like this, there's a way that COVID was not foreseeable, sure. I mean, and again, we can unpack that as well, right? And I mean that with a big, right, Mikki's right. I mean, but at the very least, we could argue that this pandemic, there are things that we could not foresee or that would be difficult to foresee, and there are things that were immediately foreseeable that we didn't, that are partly due to this. We have a system, an economic arrangement whereby the powerful get richer at moments like this. When Naomi Klein talks about the shock doctrine, part of what she's talking about is an arrangement where at moments of human crisis, at moments of human disaster, whether it's in Sri Lanka, whether it's in Haiti, whether it's in New Orleans, or whether it's a pandemic, at that moment, or 9/11, at the moment where we're shocked, at the moment where we're in emotional despair, psychological despair, feeling a sense of terror, that's when economic elites swoop in and make even more money off of this. I mean, can you imagine a moment where we have a $1 trillion bill to help the vulnerable, right? Half a billion goes to Wall Street, off the top, right? We have PPP loans, Paycheck Protection Program designed to protect small businesses. And who gets these loans? Shake Shack. Can you imagine? Shake Shack gets a loan for small businesses. I mean, this is the kind of economic arrangement that we're dealing with, right? At a moment, and I talk about this in my new book, We Still Here. When you look at the amount of billionaire wealth that grows by April of 2020, when you look at both individual and companies, right? When you look at that, what you see is a situation of vulture capitalism, where again, the elites are able to profit off of this moment, and at the exact same moment, the vulnerable are forced to work. And because because our economic arrangement is structured in such a way that we take all structural problems, the public good, and we make them individual. So we reduce protection from COVID to, for example, to wearing a mask, washing your hands, all stuff you should do. Wear a mask, wash your hands. I done had COVID. I don't want it again. Trust me, right? Both of us did. This is the COVID crew right here.
I'm not in the COVID crew.
Fair.
Don't join us. You don't want to be part of this.
You don't want these problems. You don't want these problems. But the point is that the social distance is not just a spatial marker. It's an index of privilege. Everybody can't be 6 feet from somebody else. If you in the wrong crib, you in the wrong housing project, you in the wrong neighbor, you can't be 6 feet, right? Working from home on Zoom is economic privilege. And for us to have this privilege, somebody has to be a frontline worker at Amazon. Somebody has to be working at Tyson Foods on the assembly line. Somebody has to be working at the big box retailer, ringing us up and essentially functioning as an essential worker, despite the fact that they don't have workers' rights, that they don't get pay protection, that they don't have health care, right? These things are happening simultaneously. And so these economic arrangements aren't new. This is what we've been doing for decades. This is what neoliberal economic policy has been doing for decades. And so again, we're seeing the natural extension of it. And that for me is a key building block of this moment.
Yeah.
Well, and I would argue that it's not even just neoliberal economic policy, right? We see this in every structure. We've seen this in every financial structure, because what we're really talking about is greed, right? And we tend to pretend that there is a magical way in which we can form an economic structure where greed doesn't walk in. And I would love that idea. I would love it. But we're back to history. For some reason, humans are never satisfied when they have enough. Some are, but many decide, because we don't talk about extreme wealth as hoarding, but that's essentially what it is, right? If there was not money but books, or I don't know, makeup, whatever, we would talk about it as hoarding behavior, right? So when we get to a certain point, and I'm going to use Bezos here as an example, but it's not like it's just a Jeff Bezos problem. Where we're talking about the first person to have $900 billion, $90 billion, because Bill Gates or whoever, pick your billionaire. What are you going to do with $100 billion besides just have it? 5 boats, 12 boats? I don't know. And yet we know, because we've seen this with everyone from dictators to aristocrats, you know, again, pick your structure. There are some people for whom that hole is never going to be filled. And this is sort of the paradox, right? The person who is amoral enough to profit from a crisis is a person who is amoral enough to watch the crisis play out, look at the spoils of what they have been stealing, and continues taking that money. And then say to people, because this has been the con that is fascinating to me personally through the pandemic. Well, you, individual, you will pick teachers as an example. You should be willing to go back to work. Why aren't you willing to go back to work? Why aren't you willing to do my hair? Why aren't you willing to serve food in restaurants, whatever? Because they're not asking for everyone to go back to working outside. They're asking for people to continue serving them. They don't want to be uncomfortable or inconvenienced while they make sure the people who serve them have less and less and are coerced, frankly, into that level of servitude, right? And so I've noticed, as we have been, and this is not this conversation, as we've been talking through the pandemic, people sort of saying, well, yes, I need essential workers to do insert thing here, but I don't want to have to be an essential worker. Well, Susan, Sarah Jane, Sarah Beck, how does that work? Right. Where do the children of those essential workers go? Where do the elders go? What are we going? How do you have essential workers and not think about their families, not think about their needs, not think about what they're being paid? Because I never want to hear again that retail food service, if I hear the words unskilled labor from anyone, I promise you, I'm going to make this mug, right? I'm going to make it come true, right? And I know some of you right now are like, what does that mug say? And I'm going to leave out the B word at the beginning. But I'm going to tell you, Common has a lyric about going upside somebody's head that goes with the I'm from Chicago part. Because we can't keep saying, well, I am privileged enough to work from home and those people should do their jobs, and not ask how long that can go on. Because I don't know if people realize this. I live in the Midwest. The food in your grocery store, somebody has to go get that food out the field. Somebody has to put it there, has to go out, tend to it, and then bring it back in. And sometimes there are machines. You can't really harvest some crops with just a machine and no humans though. You just can't do it. So are we going to make sure that those people are there and cared for and exist later? Or
did we lose Mikki?
Or will our next system still be in those interests, right? Because we have to start thinking about life past this is the right system or that is the right system, and start thinking about what system lets us survive.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about this. So, I mean, given all of the issues that you all have just really eloquently brought up, over the last 4 years, it seems that a feeling of political cynicism has really set in among many people with regard to our political structures, whether or not our elected officials actually are doing things in our favor, et cetera. And the question that is a burning question for us right now is the question about the election and what the vote could actually get us. And so I want to ask you all, I mean, we've been bombarded with messages about, you have to vote, or, I mean, the new sort of vote or die message, right? Vote like your life depends on it, because it does. But there's a strong feeling, I think, among many people that votes actually just don't matter. So I want to ask you all if, what is actually on the ballot, and what's your orientation to this ongoing election, not upcoming, but ongoing.
The election that we're in. Go ahead.
Oh, I see voting as a tactic. It's not an overarching strategy. It's not a freedom project in and of itself. I don't believe that our ancestors died for us to vote. They died for us to be free. But voting is an extension of that. It's an exercise of that. Sometimes you're in an election where the stakes are not as high, where the difference between one candidate and another is not significant. And there may be a principled reason, a strategic reason, a tactical reason why people may vote third party, why people may vote, as I have done in every election since I've been an adult. I've been a Green Party member since 2000, but I voted third party my entire life. There are many reasons to make strategic decisions around voting. But I've always been of the belief that voting should be in our arsenal of tactics and strategies. And it's an extraordinary privilege to suggest that it's either an extraordinary act of privilege or an extraordinary act of self-harm to ignore the power and legitimacy of voting as a tactic. We can't fetishize voting. But I've never heard a persuasive argument for completely withdrawing from the process as a means of getting free either. In this particular election, it would be unprincipled for me to pretend that I'm excited about Joe Biden, that I think that Joe Biden is a strong candidate, a talented candidate, someone with politics that are in line with mine. There are many issues on which I think that Joe Biden is horrific, and he ranges from horrific on the bad side to sort of mediocre as on the good side. But this is not an ordinary election, and what he's battling is someone who is unwilling to be moved. Donald Trump is not the first politician to advance Black suffering, to exacerbate Black misery. He's not the first candidate with horrific foreign policy. He's not the first candidate to be a warmonger. He's not the first candidate to be a white supremacist. He's not the first president, to be a white supremacist in the modern era. Not even close, right? But what Joe Biden may offer us in this election, as Baldwin talks about, is a means of buying time. That he might be responsive to pressure. Biden has no principle on busing. He has no principle on integration. He has no principle on marriage equality. He has no principle on using war as an instrument of foreign policy. But he's a politician who's willing to be swayed by public opinion, and so no politician, in my estimation, politicians don't have feelings; they have interests, and Joe Biden is willing to move along with his interests, with our interests rather, to align with his. Donald Trump is unwilling to yield to anything except his own narcissism and his own thirst for power. And I think to allow Donald Trump to be president for another 4 years is to concede the death of hundreds of thousands of other people, of the most vulnerable, of those who have been rendered most disposable, of those who have been erased by the social or ignored by the social contract. And so for me, and I'm not a particularly hyperbolic person, but I really do think the stakes of this election are that high.
I think I'm a Chicago girl, born and raised, right? The last politician I liked was probably Harold Washington. I was 8 years old. So we're going to start with that fact. We're going to move on to the fact that this is an empire. Empires are not led by good people. None of them are. None of them ever have been. Okay? I have a whole book about the women who ran empires and the people they killed. Just saying. So I view voting as harm reduction, right? We disagree slightly because I have some elders in my family who have since crossed over, who definitely fought for my right to vote. And that was what I was raised with, and I vote. I am not a third party voter unless it's an election where I feel like I am not going to be wasting my vote. And that is mostly because I grew up in a blue state. I live right next to a red state. And sometimes when you drive across the border from Illinois to Indiana, the difference is so startling that you realize, as bad as it is, and I'm not going to tell you Illinois and Chicago are great, it could be worse. It could be so much worse. At least our roads are kind of sort of intact. In this election cycle, I think it's very important for people to vote. Was Biden my first choice? No. Was Biden my ninth choice? No. There were 25 people running at one point. All of the first 5 that I would have cared to vote for dropped out relatively early. But I'm used to voting for candidates who aren't great because, again, Chicago. We haven't had to pick between a decent and a bad option in my lifetime of voting. I mean, wrong. Right? We had to vote for Pritzker because Ronner was, I ain't gonna say what I almost said. It's probably bad for this audience. But I view voting as a step. I agree with Marc, it's a tool, but I feel like the part of this that we tend to falter on is the push. I need people to show up, and this was true with Obama, and it's going to be true if Biden wins. You need to understand that first 2 years isn't a magic wand. You are not going to vote and everything's going to be fixed. I know one of the primary criticisms of Obama is who he didn't do enough for. And as someone who was a government worker at the time, I'm going to tell you that the underpinnings of what we think of as our systems, the actual structural, not just broader infrastructure of roads and streams, but the computers that handled your information, the way in which we processed your information had not been changed in nearly 30 years. So I want you to understand that he came into a house that was not just on fire, but literally falling apart and had to build the plane in midair. And he didn't build that plane perfectly, but I've never personally been good at building things while I'm flying them. You might be better. With the next person who comes in, whoever they are, whether it is now or 4 years from now, well, 4 years from now might not be anybody here, but let's hope that it's now. They are going to have to undo, rebuild, reconstruct, which means you can't just show up for this election cycle and think everything is fixed. You have to show up for midterms. You have to show up for those stupid bond meetings at your local elections. You have to, for all practical purposes, run out the people who will do things like stall Supreme Court justice picks because they don't think an election cycle should happen. Or a picture made election cycles happen. You have to be willing, I know people think of the Midwest as like all of this is flyover country. You know what you wouldn't have if we had cared about flyover country? Many of the Republican faces that you currently see that make you yell at your television screen, if we had been mobilizing in those states and listening to the people in those states who are mobilizing and sending them money, you wouldn't see some of those same faces in those seats. So we're going to have to vote, but we're also going to have to change how we approach politics and the concept of democracy. Because going forward, the courts have been packed. There is an attempt to, make this about SCOTUS. And I'm not going to say that I think that woman should get within distance of making a decision about anything, including groceries. But it is not just that. At the federal court level, at the local court level, you want change, you're going to have to turn around in your neighborhood, talk to Aunt Susan over her raisin potato salad cookies and tell her, no, you're going to have to outvote grandma. And some of you are going to have to outvote your kids. And you're going to have to look at what your kids are being recruited into, right? Because while there's all that talk about TikTok or Tumblr or whatever platforms kids shouldn't be on, you should go see how many of them are making their bank and their weight in being conservative and being adorable while they push white supremacy. Okay, because what we're looking at is not, well, when the old people die out, then racism will go away. Oh, baby, no. That ain't how that works. It's being taught, it's being transmitted, it's being passed down. That was not Grandma Gertie with the tiki torches and the ugly doctor marching.
Facts.
Yeah. I mean, and something that you all both have sort of intimated is that, voting has its limits, yeah? And that one vote is not enough, that, even after you vote someone in office, there's still work to be done. And so I wonder if you all can just, Mikki, you've already kind of done a bit of this, but talk more about the other forms of political participation that we need in this moment. So what are our avenues of political change? It seems that with the confirmation hearing of the Judge Amy, it seems that the courts don't seem like a resource for leftists. Voting has its limits. Where can we go?
I think, well, one, I think the framework has to be that we struggle every day, right? Robin Kelly says, love, study, struggle, right? That this becomes our framework. Every day we're engaged in struggle. One day, maybe 2 days out of those 365 days of struggle, we pause from struggling, walk into a voting booth, make choices, and then get right back to the struggle. So our framework has to be a consistent struggle against the powerful. Organizing is key to this. Organized people defeat organized power. That means that we have to be committed to not just sort of responding to moments, right? Which is important, right? Someone gets killed, we react. Someone gets killed, we respond. Someone loses their job, we respond. Someone has harmed them, we respond. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but again, that's like voting. That should be an outgrowth of a well-organized movement that has its sights set on multiple spaces, right? One is the policy realm, right? So that when we look at the types of policies that get advanced under a Trump administration or an Obama administration, a Bush administration or a Clinton administration, it's often the result of people who have spent decades advocating on the ground for those sets of policies and politics, right? For example, and Mikki's book, Hood Feminism, is a brilliant, wonderful book. And one of the things she talks about, I don't remember the chapter, it might be the second or the third, is this question, is the relationship of guns, right? So imagine for us to have a movement against violence, state violence, a movement against domestic violence, a movement against wars, against violence abroad, we have to have a serious conversation about guns. But the gun movement and the gun lobby is undergirded by so much money, but so much organized action that isn't reducible to how people vote. And so again, we have to say, what kind of world do we want? What's our freedom dream, right? What's the end? What's the telos of this project? And then say, what kind of organized action can we get in? That means who's on the policy front, who's advocating on a day-to-day, who are and how are we fundraising, right? Another piece is political education, right? How are we engaging the public and generating consensus for our position? Part of why, and Mikki made a great point that, greed is cuts across history, right? There's no moment in history where there's not people who are hoarding goods. I think what makes this moment interesting, though, is that we've naturalized and normalized the moment where the more you have, the better. We're rewarding people for this greed. We're celebrating this type of greed, this chestnut checkers Twitter community out there. Today, Ice Cube just announced that he's working with the Trump administration, essentially with his contract with Black America, right? What kind of political education could be engaged that would stop him from making that choice, but more importantly, that would stop the masses of Black people from or any slice of the masses of Black people from endorsing that decision? So part of our organizing effort has to be around political education on these issues, but that means we have to have a theory of the state. We have to have a theory of capital. We have to have an understanding of how the world functions, and that has to inform, again, the choices we make. It shapes the freedom dream, and hopefully, in some level, overdetermines the project that we're trying to create. And so, for me, those are the ways that outside of and so if we're doing all that, the voting question becomes a lot less fraught. Doesn't mean we don't have tough choices to make. Doesn't mean we don't have debates about this. But if we're engaged in everyday organized action, I find that when we look at that choice in November and we say, wait a minute, the country is always on fire, but the fire is spreading. As Mikki said, it's a harm reduction, right? And this choice will slow the fire down. This choice will increase it. The choice seems to me a lot less critical. That's not to say, let me be very clear, that people who don't agree with me are not sufficiently informed or educated. That's not to suggest that they simply have the world wrong, because I could be entirely wrong on this point. My point more is that when we're engaged in the organizing question, our our debate and our political aspirations don't become centered on this question in the same way. And I think that's kind of where I want us to be. I want us to be really passionate about November 3rd, but I want us to be really passionate about what we're going to do so that we don't not in a situation 20 years from now where the courts are still stacked, where at the state level, the courthouses are packed with people who don't support our values, where we have lost all of the power, all of the leverage, all of the, everything essentially, because we had our eyes in the wrong place. That's my sense.
And I would argue that we have to start with political education before high school. We have to start with political education in that K-8 space. And I'm not saying indoctrination, but I'm saying that it's very hard to unteach what people have been taught by the time they get to college, by the time they're working out in the world, if we never bother to address the lack of civics education before they got to that point, right? You have people who think the First Amendment means they have a right to speak, but no one else has a right to respond. That is not just a casual flaw. That is a direct and distinct choice being made largely, and we're back to privatization, because our textbooks are coming from one school board somewhere in Texas, as opposed to textbook manufacturers bothering to do a state by state. When we're talking about voting and harm reduction, we also have to be thinking about the fact that politicians are for purchase. Highest bidder wins more often than not. That doesn't mean that we have to purchase our politicians. I know we can all wish politicians weren't for sale. Again, grew up in Chicago. Don't know the world in which they are not. You can tell me it exists. I'm going to tell you, you just haven't seen the money move. Okay? We send our governors to jail, like 6, 7 of them. They're all for sale. It's what it is. So when you're talking about this, you have to be thinking about what is being said to kids. And I don't just mean what are you saying to your personal kids, what's being taught at school, what is happening at your local church if kids go to church, right? Churches love to send that little truck around to pick up disadvantaged children, and they promise to take them to camp or feed them or give them juice. You should probably ask what's being said at that church. You should probably be asking more questions about what messages they're getting. Now it's social media, but in their friend groups, right? Because that helpful, nice person who always lets the kids come to their house, that person that always has time to coach a team, a sport, whatever. We don't arrive at conservative cultures, at narratives that, poor people are bad by accident, right? We're talking about a system, but people make up that system. So if we're not counter teaching these things as we go, if we're not making sure that empathy and basic decency, because I would argue some of these folks like basic decency, along the way, then when we look up and you're talking to a 19-year-old who parrots some things that don't make any sense to you, right? And you're trying to roll that beautiful bean footage back to figure out where the breakdown happened, and you figure out that they never learned the right thing in the first place. They've just been taught all the wrong things. And that's not, for the record, before anyone says I'm attacking conservatives. That is not about, I want small government or I want to honor the Constitution. That's about the kind of people who think that it is okay for someone to be executed because they didn't obey a cop's order. Yeah. It is about the kind of people who think it's okay for officers to be able to break into someone's house and kill them in their bed. It is about the kind of people who think it's okay for schools to have lead in their water because, well, you should live in a different neighborhood, or any one of a dozen other things, where we're saying it's your fault that poverty negatively impacts you in this way, even though you too paid property taxes proportionally more. It's your fault politicians aren't serving you because I paid for my politician. Why didn't you buy one too? We have to shift that attitude. We have to shift that bizarre, and I know we're going to say American exceptionalism. Americans are exceptionally selfish sometimes, but we're not the only ones. We have to start having conversations around politics that start early and are ongoing and continue through a lifetime. And we stop making excuses, because I promise you, for every, well, grandma's old, so she can't take the LGBTQ. Well, she can't help saying the N-word. Grandma was busting it open in a go-go club. So she knew how to act back then. She could figure it out now. Respectability later doesn't make it an excuse. You can correct that behavior. You can challenge that behavior. Lord knows I've done it, right? Because if you don't, if you say to grandma, well, it's just how she is, what you're really saying to your kids is, it's okay for you to behave that way too. And then you're surprised. You're so surprised. I'm thinking of Richard Spencer's parents right now, how shocked they were about his attitudes and thoughts. Really? You were shocked? Because I've known everything that ran through my kid's head for the last 21 years. I promise you, there were moments, right? We corrected those moments on the spot. You should maybe think about what moments you're not speaking up for, whether it's at home, it's at work, it's at school, it's at church, if you're a churchgoer. Where are you failing to show up in between election cycles? Where are you failing to speak up when someone wants to change school district lines so those people can't come over here? Where are you failing to challenge things inside yourself? Because if you're not doing that work and you think someone else is going to do it for you, and then you're surprised when things are bad, well, honey, we got here because you were part of the problem.
Yeah, really well said. I mean, everything that you all have touched on is really, I think what part of what you all are getting at is this sort of multifaceted nature of politics. I mean, there's so much that goes into politics, but it seems like, you know, every year that there's an election, politics is reduced to the vote. And so what I really appreciate about what you all have said is that politics is really an ongoing everyday practice. And so I really hope that the audience can take on that message. I want to move to a couple of questions that have been posed by the audience. And Mikki, actually the first question is for you. So someone from the audience says, many politicians and pundits emphasize the need to win over the suburban women with policies that will earn their vote. This label seems like a racialized code for white, middle class, upper class women, the women who benefit from the status quo and the suppression of Black women, which is one of the major themes of your book, Hood Feminism. What are your thoughts on this suburban women's vote argument, and how does it ignore the vote of Black women?
I'm going to point out that someone who has chosen to move to a white flight burb, who has chosen to raise their family in a white flight burb that is explicitly unwelcoming to people who are not like them, is someone who has already told you what their vote is going to be. You can spend a lot of time on them if that is in your personal interest and personal wheelhouse. It would probably be more effective to focus on people who are currently not voting for whatever reason, whether that be because they have problems accessing ID in places where voter ID is a problem, whether it's about voter registration, transportation, whether it is a question of prior convictions, meaning that they can't vote. You can push for legislation to change that. You would do better focusing on people who have not already told you with their geographic location what kinds of choices they're willing to make. Will some suburban women, currently white women, be offended by what I just said? Abso-freaking-lutely. I'm going to point out that no one made you move there. No one makes you live there. You have all the power and choice, okay? And you have chosen to go to some place that is explicitly unwelcoming to people of color. And you may say, no, it just so happens that I live someplace that's 99% white. Jim Crow says that's a lie, right? Sundown towns say that's a lie. You can look at the history of where you are and why you're there. Work that out with your Jesus. I'm also going to point out that there are plenty of people in inner cities, in rural areas, and I'm going to focus now on poor rural voters, right? Black, white, you pick your race. Many of them are in places where polling places are a problem, not just getting to them, but the existence of them, right? Where getting your voter registration, driver's registration, all these things are a problem. So I would rather see people focus on things like that, because there's a lot of energy being given to white suburban voters, to white voters in general. And I'm going to say 53%, right? And you can spend a lot of time trying to fix that 53%, but millions more people did not vote or could not vote because of voter suppression and the undermining of the Voting Rights Act. And I promise, I know America constructs itself as a majority white country. Fun fact, America is only majority white if you remember that Middle Eastern and North African people are counted as white.
Right.
On the census. Bet you didn't know that. Some of you did. So if you focus on the people who are not able to access their own voting rights, you might get a lot further, because the 53% told you what they chose. They chose race and white supremacy over gender, over their own safety, and over their own children. I don't know what to do to people who don't believe in their own survival and self-defense. I don't know what conversation you have with them. Someone has the energy and the time. That is not my ministry.
Yeah, well said. 53%. That's, yeah. I mean, often people say with regard to the 2016 election, look at how many people didn't vote. And I always say, look at how many people actually did vote, and they actually voted for Donald Trump.
Right.
It's always interesting to me. Okay, for our last few minutes, I want to pull out one of the other questions from the audience. And this is for both of you. The question reads, many say that they are just holding their breath, hoping that Trump loses. Yet the writing is on the wall that white supremacist terrorism is becoming more organized and will continue to rise. The comment was made about the fall of an empire. What do you think we should be prepared for in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? Is there a path towards some form of stability or even progressive reform? If so, what do you think that looks like? If not, what does that mean? Big question.
It's a huge question, and a wonderful question. America is an empire in decline, but that can take a very, very, very long time. That's not weeks, that's not months, that's not years. It may not even be decades. When you look at the decline of empires, sometimes, and sometimes it happens like that. You look up and it's gone, but it's been a steady decline that's made that happen. So I think what we have to think about for the next 2, 5, and 10 years, again, is again, to be prepared, we have to start with a vision of the world that we want to see. As an abolitionist, I am constantly being confronted with the question of how can we do this? How can we end prison? How can we close down prisons? How can we create a world without policing? And it never crossed my mind when I became part of the movement that I had to see that world come into fruition for me to fight for it. That the possibility was enough for me, and its moral and ethical legitimacy was enough for me to say we need to do this and begin building. And I'm standing on the shoulders of the Mariama Kabas, the Angela Davises, the Ruth Gilmores, and so forth, who started an abolition movement a few decades ago, building on obviously other work that's happened for centuries, knowing and very explicitly stating that none of us would likely see that world. We'd all be dead before that world could come. Mm-hmm. So we have to have a radical, ambitious freedom dream that's not, as Howard Thurman would say, prisoner of the event, prisoner of the moment, right? That's not reducible to this moment, that we can imagine something far bigger than what we'll ever encounter. We have to start there. And because that allows us to not just to steel ourselves for the kind of rejection, disappointment that we see when a Trump gets elected, or when we fight for a death penalty case and they die anyway, or when Mumia Abu-Jamal remains on death row, etc., or when we have a beautiful Black Lives Matter movement and we see organized resistance and rebellion on the ground in Minnesota, and at that very same night we see a Black trans woman attacked, right, on those very same streets, right? At those moments, we have to draw from that radical imagination to say that another world is indeed possible. We have to have that language of critique to be able to say what's wrong, and we have to have the commitment and the courage to stand up and fight and resist that kind of world, that the world that we have right now. So for me, that's the pathway, right? It's beginning with an imagination, and then going back to those questions of organizing, going back to those questions of political education, and lastly, and I think this is important, we cannot allow the boundaries of our community and our political community and our political commitment to be that of the nation state, right? Mm-hmm. So in other words, we have to reinvoke that internationalist vision. We have to be thinking about what freedom and justice look like, not just in the United States, but also in Mexico, also in Cuba, also in South Africa, also in Palestine, right? Because if we don't, then I think we sell ourselves short. We shrink our movement, and we lose our capacity to have a sophisticated critique of the forces of power that consign us to this moment, right? Because capitalism doesn't stop at the border. White supremacy doesn't stop at the border, right? Patriarchy doesn't have a visa or a Hawiya, right? So there's a way that we have to be able to sort of imagine ourselves as part of a global community of people struggling to end these wicked systems. And for me, that becomes the plan long term. And I know that's somewhat abstract, but I think earlier on when I talked about organizing and political education and voting, that was the more concrete stuff. But that stuff has to be animated by a vision that's robust and ambitious, and wholly unreasonable.
And I'm going to go the other direction. I'm going to go very concrete. I'm going to say that I agree that the fall of empire takes sometimes centuries, and sometimes only part of an empire falls, not all of it, right? That's what happened with Rome. I'm going to say that the focus has to be on basics, right? Are we making sure people can eat? You can't fight on an empty belly. You can't fight if you're sick. You can't fight if you're worried about where your children are going to be and whether or not they're going to be sick. I've always been a reductionist and an abolitionist, but I have boobs and I lived in the world as a woman. So my focus is a little different than Marc's. I would say that it is important to reduce the size of what we are calling a prison system and the policing. It is important to make it as small as possible, right? I know someone's going to bring up the serial killer question. As long as I don't have an answer about serial killers and serial rapists, I cannot say I am completely an abolitionist. That is my thing. But I can say that if we were defunding police in order to fund social services, if we were pushing for police departments to have to pay their own bills, right? So because if it costs money to be brutal, you'd see a decline in police brutality. Let's take it all the way. Let's take it down to the money. If you can't afford the lawsuit, you don't get engaged in the behavior, kind of a thing. And I feel like that should be true around a lot of places, right? Whether we're undermining qualified immunity and trying to get rid of it so that officers don't feel like they can get away with the murders that they're getting away with, whether we're making sure that we bring back or fund things like after school programs, right? Because if you want to reduce violence, if you want to reduce crime, if you want to make policing unnecessary, I am on board. The way to do that is to make sure we have access to mental health, we have access to food, we have basic needs met, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Yep. Because surviving the fall of an empire, which people have always done, for the record, I know that it is scary, and I just want to say that empires fall, but people go on. It involves you building structures that make it possible for people to survive. If that means that you are agitating with your local politician to fund things ranging from Social Security to Head Start programs, that's what you do. If it's about making sure that, wages go up to living wages, I mean, you can pick your problem to focus on. I am not saying you have to be in every fight every single day, right? I am saying whatever fight you have chosen, even if all you have done that day is send a handful of emails and donate the money you could afford to do, you are contributing and encouraging others to contribute. Because if basic needs are not being met, no one can fight for freedom. No one can fight for safety, right? Yeah. I don't think abstract, I think concrete. Marc gets paid doctorate dollars to do that.
Well, Mikki, Marc, I think we're at time. I'm so frustrated because I feel like we really got to one of the exciting parts of the conversation. I was going to ask you all to talk more about reductionism and abolitionism, but looks like we can't quite get into that right now.
We'll come back again. Just have us come back.
I will. That would be great. I want to say thank you to everyone who's watching, and also thank you to the folks who submitted questions. Sorry that we couldn't get to all the questions. And then finally, thank you to our panelists for what was really a robust conversation.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone that put this together and put this on. I had a really good time, and we can do this again. I'll argue with Marc forever. It's fine.
Exactly.
Looking forward to it. All right.